Scott did a segment in his recent Coffee with Scott Adams that he covered the pushback on the Tucker Carlson discussion that I had. And he also covers the mask question, and he talks about it from a risk management perspective. Anyway, I was impressed with the quality of what he said. Not just that he was supportive, which is of course nice, but the quality of his analysis and his willingness to push back on his own audience, actually, some of which was reflexive in their dismissal of this.
Yeah, I will just say, I haven't listened to all of it, and he does say, okay, now I'm going to spend some time critiquing Bret. And so he's very forthright and honest, but he says, you need more Bret. And he salutes your ability to explain complicated things and your bravery and your dedication to following the data where it takes you. And that, I of course agree. I mean, I get a lot of you, but I still think the world needs more Bret.
You don't need more Bret, but other people might.
And it was truly heartening to see this bit from him.
Really appreciate it. Actually, when somebody pointed me to the Scott Adams thing, I didn't pick up that his discussion of me was very late in the coffee thing. So I listened to the whole thing, which was actually really interesting. Scott has a pretty advanced perspective politically across the whole map. He covers multiple topics, and I thought it was well worth a listen. So
we'll post it in the show notes.
Yeah. So anyway, appreciated the support and appreciated the nuance in what Scott had to say. David is, of course, scandalized by my having referenced Dennis Raincourt's work suggesting 17 million deaths so far from COVID vaccination. And he goes through a bizarre, in my opinion, refutation of Raincourt's number. Raincourt explores the question of excess deaths and the timing relative to waves of COVID and vaccination campaigns. And he shows what I don't think it's conclusive, but I think it's quite compelling evidence that the timing suggests that the excess deaths are not the result of COVID and are the result of the vaccination campaign. Pakman refutes this, and he acknowledges that he's playing with anecdotes here, but he goes through a rhetorical interchange with his audience who he can't hear answering. But his point was, does anybody know anyone who had a serious vaccine injury? No, I don't think maybe one or two of you do, but almost nobody does.
So he's just talking to himself?
Yeah. Does anybody know
That's
anybody?
Not an anecdote. That's pretending to be anecdote.
Right. It's like a
pseudo-anecdote.
Pseudo-thought anecdote. And I will say, I saw your thing. I'm in your audience, I guess, David. I know lots of people who were hurt. Actually, you know some of them. You don't know others, and I'm not going to out them. But yeah, the number of people who I know who actually did have a serious adverse event, including
many of whom are still hiding that fact because somehow being injured is now itself a crime. It's a moral crime to have been injured by something the government told you to take.
What's more, somebody who was a friend of mine got an injury, and I interviewed him about it, and that's on DarkHorse. So this is somebody, I didn't pick him because he was injured. He and I knew each other before he was injured. He believed the shots were a good idea, got one, was severely injured. I then got him to a doctor who knew how to treat his injury, and he's much better. But nonetheless, the number of people in our circle who do have a serious injury and the number of famous people.
Well, I mean, so the thing that will come back there is because we are people who have been talking about the lack of safety and efficacy of these vaccines, of course, we will collect such stories. And that is also true, but we know people, many people whom we knew before COVID ever existed, who have been vaccine injured.
That's right. People who we knew, and that really is the measure. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. You can't use the other because it could just be an attractor. But no, the number of people that we knew beforehand who have a serious injury is substantial. And if you don't, David, my guess is, and I I've said this before. You need to ask the question in such a way that people will give you the answer. If you go around demonizing people who talk about vaccine injuries and then you say, by the way, anybody got one? Yeah, no kidding. Those people won't be in your audience at a very high level, and they won't be in your social circles. And if they are in your social circles, they're going to be quiet about it because you're asking them to out themselves as the enemy.
And I think the thing that is very difficult to talk about, to get appreciation for, is how many people we know and how many other people we know who in turn know many people who are vaccine injured and are not out. Even in many of their cases, to their families, to their employers, to their friends who are skeptical that anyone is getting injured. So again, it's considered a moral failing. Just as it used to be, just as, being a woman in Victorian times was a moral failing of some sort, right? It is considered a moral failing by people like David Pakman to have been vaccine injured. That is diabolical. But what that does do is it changes the behavior of those people who have been vaccine injured. Not all of them, by any means, but it is certain. We know some of these people, and we know many others by reputation, by 2 degrees of separation, that many people who have been injured and who are able to obscure it in some way try to pass, and they are successful in passing. And yes, it's not the usual context in which you hear passing referred to, but there are a lot of people out there right now who are passing as being vaccinated and being just fine, but no more boosters, thank you very much. But actually, what went into that decision to not take any more boosters was the fact that they were injured by the previous iteration.
Yes, he has got a self-reinforcing pattern. It does not match what one sees from a different perspective. Lots of injured people. He then goes on to use, so Raincourt looks at many different countries and looks at the independent data sets of deaths, which are very studiously recorded in all nations, or virtually all nations. And Pakman thinks he refutes it based on his thought experiment, which is deeply flawed. He says he knows nobody who was vaccine injured, and he knows several people who died from COVID. Now, I would point out, chances that the people he knows that quote-unquote died of COVID were also vaccinated, and therefore you have to ask the question of what were the factors that contributed to their death, is high.
And given how many people are asymptomatic when testing positive for COVID, and given how many people have been very, very sick while never testing positive for COVID, COVID is clearly a fellow traveler for some people, and many cases that have been many deaths that have been attributed to COVID were not of COVID, but with COVID.
But with COVID, which is something Raincourt covers very carefully. Finally, going from Raincourt's study, which covers many different nations, Pakman claims to refute it on the basis of a pattern he says took place in Peru. Now, I watched Raincourt's presentation. Raincourt is very careful to point out those circumstances in which a pattern goes in the other direction. I suggest David Pakman have Dennis Raincourt on, and they can have this out. If David, if you think you've got this analysis beat, then you should definitely have Dennis Raincourt on, and you can humiliate him, and the world will know that these excess deaths are not the result of the vaccine campaign, and you will have done a lot of good in your mind. I don't think that's what's going to happen. And finally, I would just say Pakman, at the very end of his little piece, says that he is that 5 years ago he would have thought I was too smart to fall for the idea that these vaccines are causing substantial excess deaths. And now he's caught between two possibilities. One possibility is that I'm lying, and the other is that I don't get it. And he has a little debate. He says lying is worse, but these things are both horrifying. So
he has that little debate with himself?
Yeah. Let me clarify this for him. I'm not lying, David, and I don't think you know what you're talking about. So I suggest have Dennis Raincourt on. I'm not saying Dennis Raincourt's number is right, but I do think it's credible. I think the methodology is valid, and the nature of excess deaths is that one has to infer based on other evidence what would be causing them, which Rain Court is careful about. So if you think you've got this one nailed, then show us.